This week on Dig Me Out, Bill Janovitz of Buffalo Tom joins Tim and Jay to discuss their album Big Red Letter Day.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out. I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and joining me once again, my co-host, Mr. Jason Ziak. Jay, it's episode 201. 201 episodes in the books. Well, this will be the 201st episode. 200 in the books. We have wrapped up our very long discussion on Use Your Illusion as promised. And we're getting back to, I would think, our charter mission as we set it out 4 seasons ago, which was to dig out the alternative and independent rock of the 90s that we were fans of, or that we thought other people thought we should be fans of, that we hadn't checked out yet. And we were checking it out. So we're going back to that, Jay. And
I've been napping for a week after the Use Your Illusion episodes.
I don't blame you. Going into hibernation after that was well worth it, because
it took every bit of energy I had out of me.
Yeah. 30 songs. Some of those are 10 minutes long. You gotta rest after that. I understand.
Axel had a lot to say.
We're getting back to our roots, and to do so, Jay, this is an album that you suggested, but it's one that a lot of our listeners have been enthusiastic about us checking out, and it's Big Red Letter Day, the album by Buffalo Tom from 1993. And to help us dig deep into this record and into this band, we have from Buffalo Tom, Mr. Bill Janovitz. I hope I said that right. Is it Janovitz, Bill? Did I say that right?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. I understand, as a person who's had their name mispronounced once or twice, their last name, it's important to get people's names correct. So take great care with that. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So I mentioned in our pre-show talk, this is a record that Jay and I are both fans of, and we don't like to tackle some of the records that we're big fans of because we don't have anything negative to say, and that does make for an interesting discussion. But we do like to ask questions, and we have lots of questions for this record and for, I guess, just overall the band. Jay and I, just to give you a little history, we were DJs. We were the guys playing your record at college radio stations back in the 90s. So we were on the Buffalo Tom train back long ago. I remember the first record we got in the studio that I was like, oh, what's this? Was Let Me Come Over, which came out in 92. That was my freshman year of college, was when I got that record. So, and then Big Red Letter Day came out the year after, which I actually wanted to ask you a question about that. Those came out a year apart. And your first record came out in 88, and then the second came out in 90. So there was 2 years between records. Did you guys just have a lot of material at that point that the record came out so quickly after Let Me Come Over?
No, it's funny. Back then we were working nonstop. So we actually had our second record, Bird Brain, rather, all done by the time the first one came out, or at least pretty far down. I think it was all done. I'm just starting to go back and challenge some of my old memories and figure some of this chronology out a little bit. But I think the first one actually came out in either 88 or 89. I know our first real sort of European tour was 89, fall of 89. So the record must have come out in 89. I think we recorded it in 80. Up and finished it up in or sort of the 88 range. So then we went out on tour and on that first record and quickly sort of got a deal ready together for the second record, which was mostly on Beggar's Banquet Records, was our sort of Papa label. And they did some licensing and things. So yeah, we were on the road, and so those are those two records. And then we sort of took a little bit more time to do Let Me Come Over, and that was a big record for us in terms of touring and other things. And we were out on the road with multiple tours in the States and Europe. So it didn't, it really kind of felt like a little bit longer to me, but it was really, back then it was really just kind of a merry-go-round of tour, record. But we probably spent the most time on Big Leather Day to this day on one record. That so it was over 6 weeks in Los Angeles.
Gotcha. So the band formed essentially at the University of Massachusetts at Hammers, correct?
Yeah.
But were you playing in bands like in high school before that?
Yeah, I'm the youngest. I like to point out in Buffalo Tom. We're each a year apart. Tom is the middle brother, and Chris is the older by 2 years over me. And I moved to this town called Medfield, Massachusetts, from New York, and that's where Chris was living. But he was, since he was 2 years ahead of me, he was already up at school by the time I came to high school. But we had mutual friends, and a lot of other friends that I would go up and visit people at UMass when I was still in high school, were made friends with these guys from a different town called Andover, where Phillips is, and that's where Tom McGinnis grew up. And I remember going up to see Tom McGinnis playing this high school, college band by that time for him, with his cousin and another guy, and they were amazing. They were called Plate of Mutton, and they had all this great original material, and I instantly sort of latched on to Tom. He was playing bass at that time in that band, and I was in different high school bands that weren't doing anything like that. We were mostly playing covers and silly originals. These guys had really great songs, thanks to his cousin Phil Rattel, who was this great singer, musician, guitar player. So it was really inspirational. So, and my high school band was a little bit younger than me, so they were still in high school. So I was kind of a man without a band there for a couple of years up at UMass, and long story. I won't derail the podcast too much with all the details. But we formed up there. I got to school in '84. The band really we formed in the fall of and started playing parties in the fall of '86.
That's where I'm kind of curious. So did you have a record deal with SST while you were in college?
Yeah, for me it was like I was just leaving college when we were signing. I mean, I don't know how deep into the stuff you want to get, but we sent out Chris. Like I said, Chris was probably graduated. He was still hanging out up there a little bit, painting houses and things like that. And Tom had spent a semester or two back in Boston, taking some time off, and he was a year ahead of me. So, I mean, technically they might have been out of school, and I might have just been at the end of my semester.
Gotcha.
But we were certainly going up to Boston and recording that first record of Piecemeal with J.Mascis. But our first label that we actually signed was a Dutch label called Megadisc. And they had put out this Gun Club Live record, which we had. And so we back when we were sending out tapes, we were just going through our record collection, and they were the first ones to bite. And SST bought very quickly as well, especially with the Mascis connection, I think. And Greg Ginn was interested in it. So, but it was just a one-off deal, and it was only in the States. Actually, I think SST had it in the States and in the UK, and Megadisc was rest of the world, Europe kind of import kind of thing too.
Okay. So then how did Beggars get involved? Because they're one of those labels that I think of them in the same, I mean, they're connected to 4AD, and they have these I don't know, they seem to just, all of a sudden there's just amazing bands that just appear on their labels. And you're like, where did that band come from? Like all of a sudden, the Pixies are on 4AD or Cocteau Twins or all these bands that you don't really know where the backstory is necessarily on his bands pre-internet, like back then. They would just be like, oh my God, here's another amazing band that's coming out on 4AD or Beggars. If you were like one of those people that was, interested in labels, not necessarily, following particular sounds, but just like 4AD is always putting out really cool stuff, or Beggars is always putting out really cool stuff. How did you guys end up? Was it through SST that you got hooked up with them, or was it through that Megadisc, or was that completely independent?
I think it was sort of concurrent with. I'm almost certain that Beggars would have been the first on our list to send tapes to, because, as you point out, they were the Papa label of 4AD. Martin Mills is the founder of. At first, it was a record store, then it was a label, and they were already a big label. A lot of the records in our collection, By the Fall and Died Pretty, and the Cult. I wasn't a huge Cult fan, but we were really into that. label, and I was really into 4AD stuff. And so the Pixies, I went to go see the Pixies with Chris and probably Tom as well, in a bar in Northampton, which is, next to Amherst, where we went to school. And it was like, if there were 50 people there, that's an exaggeration of how many people were there. It was, it was a really kind of an empty, it was a place called Sheehan's where I saw like whips there, and it was a tiny basement place, but there was this buzz about the Pixies around Massachusetts already, and they had sort of not formed, but Charles met, Buck Francis met Joey up there. And then they moved to Boston and formed the Pixies. So they were up at UMass as well. And we talked about, Mascis sort of knew that had met those guys back then, but it was well before they were in a band. So anyway, I'm sure we sent tapes to those guys. I love 4AD records. I was really into this Mortal Coil and Cocktail Twins and all kinds of great stuff. So I don't know. I this is a long way of saying I don't quite know what I think Beggars Banquet started to show interest, but we were probably already a little bit along the lines, and we were certainly signed to Megadisc in a not great contract, frankly, as most first record contracts tend to be. So we kind of reworked the contract. We had a really great New York lawyer who helped us fix that contract a little bit and reset it basically. And it's always technically been a licensing deal. And when I say Megadisc Records, it's a great guy. He's one guy. He's a nice guy, but he's not just doing a horrendous contract for us, frankly. So we kind of reworked this deal, and Beggars, you can always make a different deal. It wasn't a standard record deal, and honestly, we never had what I would consider, what most people consider a standard record deal. We were like, first we had Megadisc, then we were Megadisc SST, then we were Megadisc Beggars, and then Beggars really acted as our label from then on. And Rick, the guy from Megadisc, was sort of always around, but he was just a friend really at that point. He still had business interests in us, but he wasn't making any kind of, I don't know, input or anything like that, then Beggars started, we can get into this as well. So then they started licensing us to U.S. labels, some of which were major labels later on.
Gotcha. So did they have did you have a setup where it was a number of years or a number of albums, or was it just an album to album sort of deal?
No, with Megadisc we signed a multiple record deal. With SST it was a one-off license from Megadisc, and then we signed a deal with Beggars and Megadisc sort of as partners, and that was a multiple record deal, and we ended up doing 5 records through that system, and some of which came out on East West or RCA Records here. Let Me Come Over was, I think, a BMG RCA label situation here in the States. So, it's my own eyes start to glaze over when I talk about this stuff. I can only imagine you guys.
No, I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, we've talked to a number of different people, and they all have sort of interesting, weird stories about how their deals went down or what sort of machinations were involved in them signing and weird aspects of their contracts. And there's always some odd story. We talked with a guy who runs the Afghan Wigs website, or not the actual website, but the fan site. And he was telling us about the Wigs deal where Greg Dooley had it written in that he had the when he signed with Elektra, it included he got to option a book for a screenwriting job or something it was bizarre. It was just one of those things where you could do weird deals. Or the Rocket from the Crypt one was bizarre too, where they got not just Rocket from the Crypt, but also Drive Like Jehu was signed to a major label, which is insane. They were on Interscope.
There's some good books on this topic, and the most recent that I've read was Danny Goldberg, who managed Nirvana, and it goes all the way back to being a publicist for Led Zeppelin, and then all the way up through running a label as head of Atlantic and WEA. And I think the most interesting takeaway from this sort of stuff is not so much the business side of it, and it's really kind of how important certain labels were. To be on SST Records, I just kind of glossed over some of the chronology and facts, but it meant so much for me to be on SST Records, even though they were starting to dissipate. Or I guess that's the word. Watered down their sort of brand at that point. I mean, at one point they were a label just like Sub Pop, where you would just go in without hearing the records and buy them because they were on that label because you know they were going to be good, But then they started putting out stuff that was just not that interesting. And frankly, to be honest, I think a lot of people, the hardcore sort of dudes might have thought that about us, that they were kind of going a little bit more in the commercial realm that way with us, because I think we were a bit of a bridge into what became in the 90s. Because like I said, we were starting in the 80s. We came from that sort of our band could be your life model, where we were on the road touring these sort of post-punk circuits, basically that were paved by these, Husker Du, Replacement, Sonic Youth, Dinosaur, a little bit before us, Meat Puppets, those kind of bands, of course, not a Minutemen. And I mean, those records were all very important to me as high school into college, and so that was very important. And then what you saw in the 90s was stuff that was breaking, and of course the big moment was Nirvana, was Nevermind, and then everybody was there. It's like any kind of corporate thing. It's like they're not nimble. They're not there. They don't have a great. They're not detecting trends so much. They're just signing labels who were finding these bands, and that's why I don't know about Drive Like Jehu in particular, but a lot of bands ended up going from Matador to Atlantic kind of model, And it's funny. Just one more point on that topic. I remember playing with Soundgarden at a club called The Rat in Boston. Again, only maybe 150 people there, but they had. I think they had signed to A&M, but A&M was hip enough to know that they should put it through SST. That was kind of the room. I don't know if that's actually, if my memory of that's correct, but I think they were signed to A&M and they put out the record on SST. Or I think they might have, in their telling of the story, I've heard it say that they kind of put off signing with a major, and instead they knew that they should put it out on SST. And then signed with a major, like something like that, because they knew it would give them more cred to do that. And that stuff is very important.
Yeah, that seems weird that now there's absolutely no thought about like major versus indie, because so many indie labels have, like 4AD now has a pretty, not a pop roster, but they have a lot of very successful bands on their roster now. It's not like you said, putting out like This Mortal Coil or those sorts of bands, which were part of a very hardcore audience that was buying anything that the label put out. I don't think that people have that sort of instant appreciation for what a label is sort of curating as an overall sound or aesthetic. They're just sort of like putting out records and throwing them out there.
Yeah. I mean, there's exceptions. I mean, Merge Records, I think, is still a label. I mean, even though they put out some very different, a broad range of material, I think they've still got utter integrity, and so I think people really do kind of that still means a lot to people. But there are much fewer, and much further between. Because I mean, record deals are fewer and farther between. Because I don't know, it's who's signing to major labels anymore? It's more. I don't know. I'm not asking rhetorically. I guess I just think that most people are. I think that most bands are sort of, especially with the indie level thing, it's like, what do you need an indie for unless you just don't, because everybody's doing Pledge or Kickstarter or whatever else, and you got direct to fans. I mean, back then, what was great about SST was their not only their sort of publicist, and you're on SST, so you had a little bit of a headwind with that. Or such a tailwind, head start with that. But most importantly, the booking agent we're still with was an in-house booking agent named Steve Paul, who eventually went out on his own. And he's actually a huge booking agent now. So that kind of stuff was all in-house back then.
Right, like Rough Trade was doing that all in-house. And then they sort of split off into different components and whatnot. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into some of the questions and some of the comments that the listeners had, and we can get into the album. One of the questions that we got, or one of the comments that we got, was from Brandon Trammell, who's a longtime listener of us up in Michigan. And he said, one of my favorite 90s bands He said probably not their best, but still very good. And I sort of pushed him on this, and I asked him what he thought was their best. He said that while most of the diehards would say "Let Me Come Over," he said for him it's "Sleepy Eyed" is his favorite record. Do you have a favorite album, or do you look back at any of the albums and go, "That's the one where we hit our stride. That's the one where we were like clicking on all cylinders," or do they all sort of have a special place for you?
Yeah, of course, the latter. But I don't shrink away from, every band has its peak, I think, and it would be silly to argue otherwise. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't continue to make great records, but I think we certainly hit our stride on Let Me Come Over, and then I think we took that idea to a more logical, I'm not sure if that's right, but we took it to a logical step with Big Red Letter Day, and the sound and the stride was sort of finding this acoustic electric balance and certain kind of songwriting that melded our influences a little bit more seamlessly, but also I think we had found a more distinct voice as a band and as a set of songwriters, and we certainly started to know our way around the studio a bit more. But going out to Los Angeles to record with the Robb Brothers, who had just recently before that done It's a Shame About Ray by the Lemonheads, so a record that we really, really loved. I mean, and it was rare for all three of us to really love, relatively rare for us all to be on the same page exactly with the same degree of love or hate for something. And we loved the sound of that. It was so classic and timeless, and that's what I think we were really aiming for with Big Red Letter Day. I mean, it was sort of the height of the grunge era, but we had already sort of done that. I'm not saying we were men before our time, but we sort of were on that wave before it became big. It's a pretty sludgy record, Bird Brain, our second record, but when everybody else was sort of into that sub-pop thing, not everybody else, but a lot of bands, we were sort of more going in that acoustic, electric, Stone Dean, Neil Young, more classic balance. So we did that on Big Red Letter Day, I think, really beautifully. I think the sound of that record might be my favorite, but I also really love the sound of Sleepy Eyed, which was our first real reaction record. Like, oh my God, we can't spend 6 to 8 weeks, making a record like we did. But I don't think we could have tossed off Sleepy Eyed as quickly as we did and as live as we did had we not gone through Big Red Letter Day. I'm certain of it. But I think all those three records represent sort of a trilogy, not in terms of theme, but bam, 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 a band on the road, really hot, always on the road. And when they're not on the road, they were recording. And I think we were writing at our peak as well.
I was just going to ask about the Robb Brothers. It sounded like you had the opportunity to pick who you wanted to work with and where you did that work. Is that the case?
Yeah, that was always the case. Yeah.
Okay. And you based it solely on that on the Lemonheads record? Yeah, not solely. So I'll back up a little bit. On Let Me Come Over, we had recorded with, each of our three records was done in some combination of Sean Slade and or Paul Colbury, with other people kind of coming in and out. So, famously Mascis on the first two records, but a guy named Tim O'Hare who went on to do like some Sabadell records and some other good records. He had started with us engineering on that first record. So blah, blah, blah. Till we get to Let Me Come Over, which was a Paul Colbury, Sean Slade production. And they had been working more as a steady partnership for those last couple of years at that point. And we were done with that record, but it was a time where digital was starting to come into play, and at that point, the digital component was mostly in the automation of mixing. So you'd have a mixing board, and so we dumped everything into this board called an SSL, Studio Sonics, Sonic State Logic, I think it's called. And a lot of '80s records were made on those boards, because they were really convenient. They weren't the best sounding, but they were the best sounding digital. So these guys, Paul and Sean, were still sort of learning their way around those boards. I think they were learning as we went, frankly. And we didn't come up with the best mixes. And to your question, Beggars said, this is a really strong batch of material on Let Me Come Over. Would you like to remix it? We can get this guy Ron St. Germain in. And
So we said, sure, we'll give it a shot as long as we have final approval of the mixes. So it was basically an increase in the budget. They got this guy who has his own private plane. It's just done. I think he's just done Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation, maybe, or Goo, one of those records. And he had done Living Color. And it was big 80s-ish, 90s-ish, early 90s. Arena, radio, not arena, like a radio sound,
Right.
And we were a bit shocked when we got the mixes back, but for the most part, we got over our shock fairly quickly. There were a couple songs we rejected mixes, maybe just one, in fact, Larry. But overall, I was just, all of a sudden I'm hearing delay on my voice. That it's just kind of a shock when you first hear it,
Yeah.
But other than that, yeah, then we talked to the Robb Brothers, but I'm sure we talked to a bunch of producers, as we did for the next couple of records as well. We would talk to different guys, meet with different guys, see let them know what we're thinking. And the Robb Brothers, we actually went out and tested a song with them that was on that Sweet Relief record. We just flew out to just do one song with them, and we loved those guys. And to this day, they were just three of the warmest guys, and it was like a comedy routine with those guys. But we can get into that if you want. But the making of that record was filled with, extreme highs and some of my own more extreme lows, in fact. But it was a blast overall.
Well, yeah, let's get into the making of the record. One of the things that I really enjoy about the record is the guitar sound. You mentioned that acoustic electric balance that's on that record. And I'm curious, just from a technical standpoint, what was your guitar setup at that point? Because I know in the video for Soda Jerk, you're playing sort of like a hollow body cutaway, and I don't know if that's your actual guitar.
No.
Okay,
no,
I just assumed that was
video.
sort of something for the. So what were you playing at that point? What sort of rig were you running through?
Well, I mean, my main live setup was, and it still is, my meat and potatoes is like a Gibson SG to do a Marshall JCM 800 100-watt single channel head, and anything off of that is for variation of sound. And what we love, and what I particularly love about going into a studio are the studios with a good, and this is how Fort Apache was back in Boston when we started doing our first 3 records there, was this amazing set of amps and guitars, and you could mess around with combinations of them, plus your own. And we took that to a ridiculous degree with Big Red Letter Day, because they didn't have any stuff in the studio. But instead we had a pretty good recording budget, and we just went and rented all kinds of stuff. And a funny story about that is for gearheads is that I really wanted a Marshall just to have my baseline amp, and they're like, "Oh, you got to try this thing." And they pointed to this. I don't know if you guys are into this stuff at all. But it was a Soldano head.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was covered in black and white snakeskin, and it had a black grill thing with this Soldano name on it, like it was some sort of weird sports car. I'm like, no, I'm not gonna. And they're like, you gotta try it. You gotta try it. Eddie Van Halen. I'm like, that you're making it worse.
Yeah.
I try it, and I tried it, and I absolutely love that amp. It was like a hot rodded Marshall, and you can get a really good broad range of nice warm distortion out of it. But between that and of course, I'm always using small Fender amps here and there in the studio. And I remember with Treehouse, we used a Rickenbacker. I really had a 6-string Rickenbacker sound in my head, sort of like Pete Townsend-y, a chiming but big guitar. So that worked out well with that. So there was a variety of things. I mean, Chris has a Country Gentleman, a Gretsch hollow body that we use a lot for feedback and warm low tones and whammy bar stuff, but it's hard to play live, so we only use it in the studio.
funny that you mentioned Pete Townsend and Treehouse, because one of my notes on that song is that I felt like the chorus has a Who feel. What is more from the drum kind of dynamics and the fills and that sort of thing. I hadn't really put the guitar tone to it, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, people, I'm a huge Stones fan, obviously. And I don't know if it's that obvious, but it doesn't come through necessarily in the sound of the band. But I think with that song, it kind of did. But the Who was sort of more of our attack because, the Who is essentially a power trio with a lead singer. So but an instrumental lineup, it's just the three of them. So they're covering, Pete is just covering a lot of the ground, and the other guys are trying to fill up those holes as well. So that's sort of what a power trio ends up having to do, especially when you want to be a power trio, is, you tend to kind of play differently than if you were playing with another guitar player or keyboard player.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because that's something I noticed on the record. Let's see, what song was it? Oh, Suppose. It's a song where if you listen to the guitar riff, you could imagine what a bass player and a drummer might bring to it, and it would be a pretty not as an interesting song. And they don't do that. They're more laid back. They're not pushing, and the combination of what you're playing on guitar and what the rhythm is doing is complementing each other. How long did it take you guys to figure that dynamic out and how to play off of each other as opposed to I guess compete or kind of do the obvious?
You mean from the start of our career to that point, more or less?
Well, the three guys in this band. How long did it take you to figure out how to do the trio thing and just how to play together?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, Tom was a bass player. He had started on guitar, then switched to bass to be in his cousin's band, and then he switched to drums to play with us. It was something he had fooled around with drums because they were left in his parents' basement when they were rehearsing, so he would always fool around with drums. Chris, I don't think Chris was thrilled to get saddled with the bass, but I had most of the songs at that point, so it didn't really make sense for me to be playing bass. And Chris was into it. Chris was open-minded, but Chris attacked his bass, and to some extent still does as a guitar, and that was sort of the Lou Barlow thing as well. And I think Chris was probably pretty influenced by Lou in that respect. He was around and really playing a bass through a Marshall head and strumming chords, and Chris was really doing that for a while too. And Tom was just really learning as he went there on the drums. So I mean, I hear our first record, and I think there's some great stuff on it. I'm not as in love with most of our Bird Brain record. I think we kind of went off into my songwriting in particular went into a kind of a darker spot there, and I think we're trying things on. But as far as playing together, each show and each record was a different iteration towards that. Maybe we really hit it on tour, after around first record and Bird Brain, so that when we did come into the third record, I mean, like I said, those first two records were done before we even hit the road. So that's why I think you hear a bit of a growth spurt on Let Me Come Over, something that we sustain at least for those three records, and then even to this, to take it to another end of things, when we took a hiatus from each other, we would regroup and play still once a year or twice a year here and there. And that chemistry, that bouncing off each other, as you say, was sort of what kept us going, because it's sort of undeniable. It's a personal chemistry thing that we've got. And some of it's just personal, the way we were attracted to each other as musicians in the first place, and our sensibilities and our tastes, but also mostly just from playing for 20 years together now, 28 years. So I was just out with them in September, and I've played with a few different bands now, and it's just nothing like going home to Buffalo Tom in a way, because it's just like I don't even have to think about stuff. It's so second nature.
I want to go back to Treehouse for a minute because I have a couple questions about that song. Well, actually, one of them is from one of our Twitter followers, Steve Reynolds. He asked, what was it like having the Water Sisters sing your lyrics on Treehouse? I'm guessing he's talking about the backup vocals that are in that song. And the Water. Can you explain who the Water Sisters are?
Yeah. So, hey, Steve. I know who Steve is. The Water Sisters. Now, a lot of this stuff I've learned since. Most recently they were featured in 20 Feet from Stardom. They're probably the most featured in that, except for Lisa Fisher. Great documentary if people haven't seen it. It's just about background singers, made by a great director who I know named Morgan Neville. I didn't, I didn't know who they were. I told the Robb Brothers that I really wanted to hear like this Stonesy chorus at the end. Think of like how there's the coda of "You Can't Always Get What You Want," where they get that great sort of London Bach choir going. But I definitely wanted a gospel feel to it, and there are certainly the gospel changes of the chorus. So they said they didn't even. As soon as I said women background singers, they just said Water Sisters, and they just called, and they were there. I don't know. I feel like they were there the next day, and I have a photo. You can kind of see a photo on Buffalo Tom and maybe my own Facebook page and one of the albums of me standing there with a pencil, pointing, like kind of telling them how the arrangement goes. And they're looking at me. You just see my back, and you see the Water Sisters with like one headphone on, looking at me, listening to me. And it was incredible to see them in that movie. And I had no idea at that point. I mean, the Robb Brothers were telling me stuff that they were on, and I'm sure over the years, once the internet really became up and running, because it wasn't around the time Big Red of the Day, I think I learned their discography on allmusic.com or something. But they were prominent on Thriller, and that's just probably the hugest record they've been involved in. But they were on so many other records, and I mean, what an honor to have them. And that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg for LA. I mean, there was all kinds of crazy stuff about who was coming in and out of there at any point in time, from Jerry Goffin, who I met, to Hank Shockley, who produced the Public Enemy records, to, Rita Ford was there the entire time. And Rick James was in and out of our, he was hanging out on our couch in our studio. It's funny. I put up a picture of Chris.
Wow.
The final episode of Cheers with Rick James in the lounge.
Wow. Okay. Wow. That's awesome.
Talk about choosing that studio. Was that did that come with the producer, or did you guys make the choice to go out to LA to do that record? And did you pick the studio?
They owned the studio. So it's Cherokee Studios. It's still there. I think it's still there. One of the Robb Brothers, Dee, has passed away. So the Robb Brothers, a little bit of background on them. Their last name was not Dee, it was something else, but there were three brothers who grew up in Michigan with an auto executive dad, and they hooked up with Del Shannon, who I don't know if Del was from Michigan originally, but I believe he was. And he got big, and they were sort of his band, and then they became the house band on the TV show Where the Action Is, which was a Dick Clark show or concurrent with American Bandstand in the 60s. And so they got to play with all these people, Ricky Nelson, whoever else, and they would go out on these cavalcade tours, and they would back everybody. And then they came back to Los Angeles during that mid to late 60s period, which was just the Sunset Strip, which is crazy, and then they bought a ranch out next to the Spawn Ranch where Charlie Manson was. So they've got Manson stories, and they had their studio out there. Then they had a studio on a yacht at some point. And, it's just, I don't even want to tell you all their stories because they're their stories, but they involve, freebasing and Ron Wood and Ringo Starr, and Rod Stewart was there. And, then our dad walked in and he's freebasing with, it's just crazy stuff. And so much of it was like, do we believe all this? And, and then, like I said, there we would be with Lita Ford and Rick James hanging out. And in one day, by the way, mixing I'm Allowed, we were in the mixing room. So the studio was a complex of like three studios, a big studio A, And then they had, actually, it might have even been 4. I think it was 3, though. And then they had one with an SSL board, which I referenced before, which was very attractive to hip-hop guys. So Ice-T would be there from time to time. Different, and it was an interesting time because it was after the riots, soon after the riots in LA. So there was a lot of weird undercurrents going on there as well. But in one day we were recording, mixing I'm Allowed, and we had Jeff Skunk Baxter there, David Lynch, and Angelo Baldamenti is his name, I guess, and Gene Simmons from Kiss, all at different points in time during the same day. It was like a bizarro talk show, It's like, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, David Lynch, for coming in. Now look, it's Gene Simmons.
So would they like sit and watch you record and work, or what were they doing?
Yeah, so it's just like popping in. They all knew the Robb Brothers who owned the studio, of course, and I mean, at any given point with the Robb Brothers, you would maybe do about an hour's worth of work, and then 3 hours later, you're at the end of hundreds of stories, or somebody pops out and you don't see them again for a little while. So it was a really easygoing pace. We only worked 5 days a week, and so that's why we were out there for a couple of months, I think. So they would just pop in and say, "Oh, you got to hear these guys," and they knew we were friendly and sort of starstruck by it all. So I think anybody else, they'd be a little careful with, but like, "Oh, you got to come in and hear this song." And so, I'm Allowed, I think they really particularly liked, and they wanted to show it off. So I remember just watching the back of David Lynch's head, and I was really enamored by everything he had done at that point. He was sort of still at his peak of popularity, and I'm just watching him listening to my song, and he turns, "It sounds like a hit, boy." And then that same day, I remember Gene Simmons singing. He got up in front of me, and because he was really passionate about Gene Pitney, apparently. So he's up in my face, like I'm sitting on the couch, and he's standing, he's sort of looming over me, huge guy, imposing presence, and he's singing "A Town Without Pity" to me a cappella from start to finish, as I recall.
I'm surprised he's never taken credit for your success. Like he just has a story that maybe he discovered you.
It's maybe if we had some huge success, he would take the credit.
Well, that never stopped him before. I mean, according to him, he's invented everything and discovered everyone. So,
yeah.
Speaking of "I'm Allowed," I actually had a question about that song. Not to get all into the technicality stuff, but the guitar solo on that song is really cool. It almost sounds like a Leslie organ or something, but it's a guitar, I think. Can you kind of get into what the effect is and what you're doing with that solo?
Yeah, I mean, the Beatles and the Stones both, and George Harrison in particular, loved the sound of the guitar going through a Leslie speaker. I think there's a couple things on there. I think the main guitar that opens up the song, you hear the riff, is just a tremolo, probably going through a Fender amp or something. And then that solo comes in, and that's going through a Leslie. And so a Leslie's a revolving speaker, and, for your listeners that may not know what it is, it's an organ speaker. It's really the sound of the Hammond organ in a lot of ways. And so you get these little preamps that you could plug your guitar into, and maybe even overdrive it a little bit, but you could also put in a little overdrive pedal as well. So, it's definitely a Beatles sound. I mean, the Stones didn't do too much of it, but it's definitely there on Exile with like Let It Loose and things like that, which sometimes I think people are listening casually, they think it's an organ and not a guitar, but it's actually a guitar.
Yeah, I had to kind of pin my, really focus in. I'm like, is this, the notes that are playing, like, it doesn't seem like that's not an organ hit. Like the way that the notes are hitting, it's got to be a guitar. But I struggled with that for a little while.
You performed that song on Conan O'Brien, and it's definitely more. Do you remember how you did that live? Because it's more pronounced on that performance.
Yeah. At some point, I don't know if I did it on Conan or not, but I used to have a phase shifter, which would get the rounding sound, the sort of revolving sound. But a Leslie has two speeds. It's sort of either slow phase shiftery, like Hendrixy kind of. He used to use different pedals to get that, like the neutron phase. And then there's also the fast setting, which sounds like the shimmering, cascading sound. And so I used to hook up two pedals, and I kind of went back to that, which is what I do to kind of approximate it now. Is a phase shifter and a tremolo pedal going at once. But there's a really good. There are a lot of really great pedals nowadays that get that sound, almost exactly. You don't get the movement of air that you get with a Leslie, but you get that shimmering sound. And there's a line 6 mixer modulation pedal that can get a pretty good approximation, but they fall apart after a while.
Can you talk about the performance on Conan? What was that like, and maybe even talk about that song a little bit, because it sounds like there was some pretty big expectations for that song.
I'm not sure. I know we were on Conan twice, and I don't know if they were both on that record, but I think because Soda Jerk was the first single off that record, and that got pretty good play, but maybe we didn't get on Conan with that. Maybe we got on Conan with I'm Allowed, and then we're on Conan later with Summer, maybe on the next record. I really don't know. We were on Conan twice. We were on 2 Jon Stewart shows, and I always forget which songs were on which. But I mean, the experience of first being on Conan was thrilling. It wasn't like being on Letterman was, later on when we got to do that, because Conan was a new guy on the block, and there was he I don't know if people remember, but he got off to a really rocky start, and people were ragging on that show, and nobody really thought it would be around for much longer. But maybe by the time we were on there, it had started to gain traction. But I liked Conan a lot, and I really loved the guy who books it, named Jim Pitt, and he still books it. He's a fan and a good guy, and but Conan was a great guy, a really friendly guy. Came up to us, and he's a Boston guy, so he knew us, and we talked about Boston stuff, and talked about my guitar, and talked about looming presence, and he's like 7 feet tall.
All right.
But to be on national TV was a blast. I mean, just those days of being out in New York and cars, publishers taking you out to dinner afterwards. I mean, you felt a bit like a rock star. I mean, it's easy to get swept up on all that, and I just tried to enjoy it without worrying about, what does this mean,
Mm-hmm. And you made videos for Soda Jerk and I'm Allowed. What was that like, especially in that time period? I mean, videos were so important. How did you guys step into that? What was that experience like?
Videos really could make or break you, and did make or break you back then. And I was not anti-video. I used to love 120 Minutes and its precursors like Cutting Edge, or they had a couple other alternative nation. I forget which shows were which, but they sort of became famously 120 Minutes, I think, was the longest lasting of their like Sunday night shows or whatever they were. And on our first tour, we were spoiled here in Boston. So many colleges, great college radio. That's how we got exposed to music. Then you got to the middle of the country, and the only exposure that there was to new music were these sort of ghettoized, Sunday night shows on the video. It's like, but that's the first time I heard I remember the first time I heard How Soon Is Now by the Smiths was in a video, and just being struck by how beautiful the video was. So I looked at it as another opportunity. I hated doing them, though. I just felt like I hated standing around and miming words and hours and hours and hours. And there was usually it was so uncomfortable usually. And the video directors had these ideas that they wanted you to execute. And sometimes I felt like, I really started to feel like that's where I was compromising, and I didn't want to be a complainer, a lot of the time, because you're executing somebody else's vision now. So it was a bit of tension with that, but Soda Jerk did pretty well. I don't think it might have been a buzz-bin clip, but those were the kinds of things that really were like, oh man, we're gonna get all these spins. And I remember we got Kevin Kerslake for that one. He did the Teen Spirit video, and he had done the B video for Blind Knowing, which completely broke that band open. Like that, I don't think anybody really known who they were. So, they were very important, and to the extent that you actually could blow the equivalent of a recording budget on one video.
Wow, that's now that I know that those videos, I can see the style between the three, and that they all have like a unique set. Like you guys are below the tree, Teen Spirit's in the gym. So there's definitely a formula to what he was doing. And I also could tell just by watching the video now, just how long you guys probably mimed that song standing underneath that tree. It seemed like it could have been days.
It was out in the canyons, and it's just this dusty portion. And I got to say, of the videos we've done, that was probably the most comfortable. For I'm Allowed, we're in this house up in Big Bear up on a mountain because they wanted to get a wintry feel, and it's freezing, and they wanted me singing in front of this screen, which you'll see in the video. It's kind of like a wire fence rusted, sort of almost like a fire grate kind of thing, and it fell on my forehead. It tipped over, and the director of that video was a tyrant, and he was a jerk, and he alienated he was yelling at the crew the whole day, and it just was a bummer of an experience. We had to drive hours to get up from Los Angeles to this place, and it's just like, it's like, this is not what I got in it for, to do this kind of shit,
Yeah, and the Soda Jerk video was much better. The second I'm Allowed, it reminded me, it just felt very 90s. Like it actually reminded me of Pearl Jam's Jeremy. I wasn't sure if it was the same person or not, or if it was just some of the style.
His name was Sam Baer. He was a nice guy to us, but then it really turned into kind of a sour experience. He was really frustrated and artiste. And I think to me it had more of a. He had described it one way, like it was going to be this destroyed-looking film, and it turned out to be like more of a VH1 feel, which back then there was a distinct difference between VH1 soft rock and adult rock thing. And
oh yeah.
Jay, you'll remember Sam Baer because he did the video for, I think, Hal and Maggie's Alcohol.
Oh yeah, and they talk about it being miserable. You interviewed them? Yep. Okay.
I talked to Happy from
it's a very strange. Yeah. It's strange in the same way that I'm Allowed is, and they were miserable as well. So,
I actually had a question about the Treehouse video because it's a little weird. There's a giant stilted man with Gene Simmons hair running through a forest, and a group of kids tormenting him, and then they burn him alive at the end. Yeah. Do you understand what the concept is? Because I was a little lost. Other than maybe attacking Gene Simmons.
No, that was an allusion to, and this was the director's idea. These two English directors. We went outside of London in the forest, out in the suburbs. I don't know if we were west, out of Richmond somewhere. Really, I actually kind of liked doing that because the guys were really great, and that was a wintry night as well. So they had been taking inspiration from this creepy old movie called The Wicker Man. You ever hear that?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
It's this old
they
English
remade it
movie.
with Nicolas Cage a couple years ago.
Oh, did they? Yeah,
it's
so
awful.
That's what that was all about. They were kind of recreating that. So it was supposed to be this giant wicker man, and we were supposed to be. So you see us in the red curtain kind of tent, and that's supposed to be in the skirt of the wicker man.
Yeah.
Just talking about this stuff makes me laugh. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. It's funny, since I've got kids. I got a daughter who's a sophomore in high school now, and a kid who just turned 10 today, a boy. And every once in a while, it's been a long time, but when YouTube starts to really become a thing, I'd pull those out and say, oh, look at this. Like, what's going on? Look at Dad's long hair. That was another weird choice.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to have those same conversations with our kids at some point. Not for a long time, though. Not for a long time. And then the other question, actually, since we're on Treehouse, I wanted to ask you about the lyrics. Specifically, so this has been a lyric that has probably been stuck with me since I heard the record 21 years ago. It's in the second verse. You start out the second verse with the line, "Your hurt drizzles forth twice nightly," which even just saying it now is a mouthful. And I'm wondering how you arrived at that lyric, because the melody is very... I understand the melody, but I don't understand the word choice, because it's such a hard group of words put together and you have to spit them out. I'm just curious about where the lyrics came from, not just in that song, but just overall, if you were writing in a more of an abstract sort of way when you're writing your lyrics, or if you were writing on concrete ideas, or if you were just simply doing the Keith Richards sort of finding the lyrics based on the melody, or what your approach was. But specifically with that one has always sort of caught my ear and been stuck with me.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you said your bird or your hurt, but it's your bird drizzles forth twice nightly. It's the drizzles forth that it catches you. That's actually at least what I can say about my songwriting on that one is that at least I sustain the theme from there's this bird flying away, and it's the seasons changing kind of thing. Obviously, if I could easily just say seasons change and blah blah blah, and then you've got Moon in June, but I was trying to do something different. That wasn't just a vowel movement, I should say. It was, I would write music, and then I would try to find the words to fit. So, and I've been looking back at some journals recently, and most of my journals are not like narratives. They're all these random images, and I could see the literal, for example, drizzles forth was probably just some little poetic thing I put down, and I just thought of like the rain. Being delivered like the rain, like a bird coming down from drizzle, is probably what I was thinking there. But it was, for me, it was like trying to find new ways to say things in a kind of stream of consciousness way, but really trying to tie them together. I was always very much under the influence of symbolist era Dylan, like the surrealist Dylan of Highway 61, and like what the hell he's thinking about with jewels and binoculars hang. It's interesting, but what's he singing about? You don't know. It's like sort of eliciting feelings, and you kind of got an idea. And that's what I was really interested in back then. I've become less obtuse as I got older, and I wish I could have written more directly sometimes. But, I listened to Pavement. I listened to some of the other bands that were doing similar things, and that was interesting to me. I was trying to figure out how to put poetry to pop music, but I think it was often too clever or too obscure for its own good, and maybe that's one of the reasons we were never like a gigantic hit band. Even Tangerine from the next record, from Sleepy Eye, there's a pretty direct pop song, but all kinds of silly, weird change phrases, tons of phrases, I was going to say. Things that are, there's a little bit of a pun in here and there. I think sometimes that, not that I was overthinking it, it's probably the case that I didn't think about it enough. Sometimes I just put something that fit the first time and didn't think of how it tied together with the first verse, for example.
Gotcha. Well, I feel like sometimes you, and I like this in a lot of songwriters, is that the chorus, although the melody of the chorus is same from chorus to chorus, the words were not the same. And that can throw people off. If they don't hear that same hook vocally every time, they kind of, I don't know, it confuses people in a pop sense. Whereas if you hear that simple, like repetitive pop chorus, then that is what people latch onto. But if even if you're singing the same melody, there's a band that Jay and I are both a big fan of called Cursive out of Omaha, and the lead singer Tim Kasher would often completely ignore the words in multiple songs, but the melody would be exactly the same in that second time through the chorus. It's just different words. And, that I think that's a really interesting way to approach a chorus, but also it's probably a hindrance in terms of an overall pop audience who are not used to that sort of complexity.
Yeah, and to call it complexity, in my case, it would be flattering. It's not like Zappa or anything. It's just
Right.
it's just not. I don't know if I was really consciously thinking about it one way or the other. But Soda Jerk is a prime example of what you're talking about. Like, it's a simple song, but for some reason I feel the need to do, and same with Taillights Fade. It's like each chorus has even that one. It sounds the same. Each phrase is a little different, and to this day, I'm not sure if I'm singing the ones that are on the record or not. And I think that's to a fault in our case. Like, I think we were writing very, in a lot of ways, classic pop songs, and maybe that was the reason here and there that somebody just didn't latch onto it at the right radio station or something. Cannonball was just, when that came out of the radio from the Breeders, it was like, bam, I wish I wrote that. And then, we got to like our later record, the last record before we sort of split up for a hiatus, on Smitten, and we were in the studio with Dave Bianco. We were in pre-production. He was the engineer and producer, and he came from this very classic school of he was one of these guys that came of age when the Beatles were at Sullivan. So he was into the Beatles, Big Star, Birds, and that kind of era, Badfinger, power pop. And he's the songs that didn't have bridges. He's like, where's the middle eight here? And then don't just give me an instrumental middle eight. Well, why aren't you writing words here? You've got to have it, basically. So it was to an extreme the other way. It's like, there are rules that we had been ignoring, But it to me, it wasn't like punk rock ignoring. It was just being ignorant of some cases of what pop structure should be. But I think that was both to our benefit and detriment. I think it made us interesting in a lot of ways, not predictable, but also probably might have cost us a little bit more mainstream acceptance. But I tend to think the latter has more to do with extra musical things like, publicity and whether a front man looks a certain way and how they look in the video back then.
Well, it's funny you mentioned middle eights, because I actually have a question about one of the songs on this record that does have a middle eight. That's Would Not Be Denied.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a question. So there's the middle eight in that song, or the bridge, whatever you want to refer to it as. And then you go into the third verse. And there's a weird thing that happens when you go into the third verse. The vocal sort of starts as an echo and then actually kicks into full volume. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought it up, in fact. Yeah.
How is that achieved?
Well, it's easy to do it now. So sometimes, you get into the studio and you want to try things that you've been listening to on your records, or you want to capture a certain thing from your record collection, inspiration. I'm glad you brought up the middle eight part of that, because that is a classic example of what Dave Bianco wanted on our Smitten record, which was a bridge that was the climax of the story, that told the story. And that's where, if you listen to Beatles songs, that's what they do. It's like it's like the setup, and then the middle eight tells what's going. Here's why I'm saying this, and then bam, So, but then to get to that effect, there was that big rest after the bridge. It just stops, and then it starts off with that sort of half step up and half step down lick again. But in that space, I really wanted to capture a ghostly vocal thing, like a pre-echo. So if you listen to was it Whole Lot of Love by Led Zeppelin, where it's like, way down inside, is that Whole Lot of Love? Woman, you.
Yep.
So that was an accident on their record that they left. It had been imprinted on the tape. I forgot the exact details of that. But it wasn't an easy thing to do back then. Like now, you could have a pre-echo, just switch it around digitally somehow and put it in there. But then I had this, the Stones have all these records where you hear Jagger's ghost vocal sometimes very prominently. Like if you listen to Angie, for example, you hear Jagger's reference vocal where he was just singing with the band while they were doing the live basic tracks. You can hear him because he's singing in the room with them really loudly, walking around with a microphone. And so sometimes his ghost vocals are almost as high as his real, quote unquote, overdubbed vocals that when he went in to do the real track. And the phrasing's all mismatched because he's still trying to write the song. So I wanted that kind of effect. And I drove Robb Brothers to the point of them being the most upset that we saw them during that 8-week period. Because first of all, I had to articulate what I wanted. So I probably brought up a couple of examples. Then they felt like we were just chasing some sort of whimsical or whatever idea that wasn't really concrete or substantial to the song. And then they couldn't execute it right. For the longest time, it took us to get that right. And they were pissed off. I mean, they're like, I remember it coming to this point where it was like, you really want to do this? Is this really? Because it was near the end of the recording sessions. It was all driving each other crazy at this point. And I remember Chris leaving. I think Chris left the room because of the tension. And, so that's the best way we deal with things is often is like if things are getting tense, when one guy disappears for a few hours and that sort of thing. But that's how weird it got on that. I'm glad you brought that up. I would never have remembered that.
I was just going to ask, maybe it's more of a statement than a question, but just one of the things that stood out to me, especially going back to this record, was the confidence that you guys had in doing slower songs and, songs that were ballads or approaching ballads. I feel like that was, especially in the way that you were doing them, I mean, they're very sincere and, kind of hard on your sleeve. At that time, I mean, I don't know, my memory is that there weren't a lot of bands doing that. And I'm so glad that you guys did do that. I mean, I think it makes it, those are some of my favorite songs now, and it kind of makes it a timeless record for me. But was that ever an issue for you guys? Did you feel like you should be more angsty because music was angsty at that time and maybe you shouldn't be? Because at times it almost approaches like a country kind of thing, which is awesome.
That's a great question too. That's a great question. I have to put myself back in the mindset, but it's not far from where I am now. Like I remember hearing, emo bands that started to cite us as an influence before that was a word, before that was a category, because we were out there. But we used to tour, not tour a lot, but we played a lot of shows in various combinations with American Music Club or Mark Eitzel. So, like Eitzel would open up for us every once in a while. Sometimes I opened up acoustic for American Music Club. Not that we were friends. In fact, we weren't really friends. It's just that sort of happenstance and put us together. It's not that we were enemies or anything either. It was like, it was just like professional. Hey, how you doing? Good to me. But to me, Eitzel, a lot of my friends and people really, 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 really loved American Music Club because it's like, and to me, they were one of those bands. I was going to backtrack a little because I didn't love a lot of the stuff, but the stuff I loved a lot, so Lost Harbor, as it's called, or Last Harbor. I haven't listened to some of that stuff in a long time, but he could be a bit much for me, and I was out there with my heart on the sleeve. But I would watch Eitzel and go, man, I don't know how he pours it out like that. it's over the top sometimes. I go, what I wanted to do is have my emotion tied to some concrete imagery that wasn't just about, the sorrows of young Bill here. And Chris as well. I mean, we have two primary songwriters in the band. We really did write together once we brought these songs. So yeah, Chris doing Late at Night, which is probably, if not our most emotional ballad, it's up there. Until It's Fate, of course, and I'm Louder are both big ballads as well. But it's really pouring. I mean, I know Chris, and I know, and he knows me, and he knows where these things come from, and vice versa. And Chris and Tom just watches us both write these words. And Tom is the most taciturn guy you'd meet in a band, and I'm sure he's just oftentimes like, wow, he just needs to look away while it's going down.
I'm glad you mentioned Late at Night, because there's a history to that song for a lot of people, in that it was featured in a very special episode of My So-Called Life, very prominently, almost a completely wordless scene where that song is almost basically a character in that show. And I'm wondering two things. I don't remember if there was no video for that song, correct?
Correct.
So was there ever a thought of, hey, this song has just been on a national TV, or this is going to be on a big TV show? Should we make a video for it? Should there be a single out? Should there be an EP? Something correlating with that, with the release? Because it was only about a year after, I don't even think it was a year, total year, maybe a couple months after the album came out that the show was on. And then I hear some tinges of especially in like the guitar lead stuff that you're doing, almost like 70s Stones, like some of the more countryer stuff, or getting into like I don't want to say like Skinnerd, but like some of, you know what I mean, like that country rock that
I heard
was taking place.
I heard the band. That was
the band. That's a good one too, Jay. The band.
If I could put them in a jar, I know they wouldn't stop. I'd do it if I could. I hope you know I
So could you address those two very different points?
Yeah, that's an interesting song. Obviously, that ties together with this emotional stuff in a lot of ways. And I just want to say that with our emotional stuff, up to that point, our shows were filled with a lot of boys wearing white baseball caps of the day, like with the word Cox on it, usually from South Carolina, I gather.
Frat guys.
And untucked, they were either frat guys or guys that looked like frat guys. And so we sort of come from this garagey punk kind of circuit, even when we were playing with My Bloody Valentine on the tour for Let Me Come Over, it was a bit more artsy, but I think our audience at that point was really these guys that were sort of just regular guys that were really wrapped up in the emotions of the song. The same kind of guys I think you see at Bruce Springsteen, because Bruce Springsteen can express his emotion in this cathartic way. And I think it was a very similar dynamic to us. Now, I was never gigantic, and this was always a surprise to people. And I totally respect Bruce. And I grew up in Long Island, and my wife is from New Jersey, and she grew up, with Bruce as a saint. And to me, Bruce was always around in the 70s, and I just never quite got it all, or got some of it, but it wasn't like a guy for me. It wasn't one of my main guys, but I completely see the parallels, and I see our audience. But with Late at Night, all of a sudden, with that in that show, the audience completely the makeup of the audience demographics changed for the better. There was just a lot more girls, and they were literally girls, because a lot of those girls were teenagers when that show came on. So the women that we got, like my wife watched it. We were only 30 or young 30s, if that, maybe late 20s still. So she was really into it because it reminded her of her husband. Just the critical acclaim of the show was pretty consistent with, you know, what happened there with Freaks and Geeks. It was just like something that was realistic to some extent. Anyway, we remember the buzz about the show, you know, itself, and then getting the invitation to be on it. We were like, totally, yeah, of course. And then seeing the script, and they mentioned the word Buffalo Tom in it, like, I don't know, 200 times or something. It's like the joke that was amongst our friends was like, how much did you guys pay them per mention of that? It's so crazy how many times they mention your band. So it was the single biggest piece of publicity that we got at that time that really helped, that you could see demonstrably. You could see the change, and it was a really beautiful experience. And meeting those kids, we were hanging out with Claire Danes, and they were just 15 at the time. And they were hanging out in our trailer. Jared Leto really wanted to know what it's like being in a band, because he was in a band with his brother already. His brother was in there, and they were, you know, it was just a blast. It was like to be the older guy talking to these kids who were coming up. And she was wonderful. And so, and, you know, in fact, Devin Odessa, who plays her Goody Two-Shoes friend, we had her come back later in our Wiser video for Wiser. And she was fantastic. They're all great. And Claire was wise beyond her years. I just couldn't believe how confident she was as a person. So it was a great experience. And then, in terms of, you know, capitalizing on it and putting it on a single, I don't know. I can't remember. I couldn't tell you right now what the thoughts were. I think it was so far out from the records, and I think they wanted to put that, and they did, and Soda Jerk on a nice little soundtrack, which also sold very well and had Juliana on it and some other friends of ours, Sonic Youth, I believe, maybe even. It was a really great record. I mean, there were these great compilation records, like, too, you know, alternative soundtracks. And so I don't think we had already done, like, I think that record was pretty much played out by then. And then it gave us this other boost. So it almost became its own video itself, because they kept playing it. It was on MTV. So it really had a lot of legs. And I don't think we could have done, you know, I don't think there was any point in releasing it as an actual CD single or something back then.
Gotcha. I think you talk a little bit about the guitar playing on that.
Oh yeah,
on that particular song.
Yeah, I mean, Leonard Skinner was actually something that Chris and I both shared a love for as kids. I don't necessarily hear that in particular, but I wish I could have Steve Gaines or whomever, or Albert Collins. The band were a bit more of an influence for me than Chris, who I don't think we ever liked the band very much. But to me, it was mostly, I felt like I was always playing Neil Young solos. And when my guitar playing got compared to Mascis, is mostly because we both grew up listening to those Neil Young going up the neck runs. And I was never as fluid or melodic or anywhere, even in the same neighborhood as Mascis, who is a guitar hero. But with Buffalo Tom, I really felt that Neil Young style really fit. And that's who I grew up, you know, between Keith Richards, Pete Townshend, and Neil Young. Those were the guys that I played most, I felt like the most direct influences on me. So that's kind of what I hear there, you know, those like two-string ringing notes and bends and feedback, and that's, I think of Neil more than anything else.
The last question I would have on it would be, I think this album is engineered beautifully, produced beautifully. I think it sounds great now, which is, you know, we listen to obviously a lot of 90s records, and unfortunately that isn't the case for a lot of the records we listen to. Did you guys, and the material's timeless. I mean, is that something that you really, as you went into this record, setting out to do, or is it just, you know, sort of an accident?
No, it was definitely what we wanted to do, and you know, like I said, I think Let Me Come Over has some interesting sonic moments. I love Paul and Sean. I think we were all learning together. But then, it got taken away and remixed by a different guy. So it's got some great sounds, but it does sound a bit more dated to my ears and a bit more like young guys still working it out. Still a little bit. I mean, it's definitely a confident record, but not as confident as Big Red Letter Day. So, when we went out and met the Robb Brothers, the reason we were attracted to them, as I said, was because of the classic warmth of the records they had done, and most relevant was the It's a Shame About Rain. We were good friends and went way back with the Lemonheads, and so we love how it just took the Lemonheads and Evan and sort of really shaped it up into this great classic record. I mean, that's one of the classics of that time to me. But it also tied together with the Robbs as these old 70s guys. I mean, they just approached making records the same way that they had in the 70s. And that's the golden era of record making, is the 70s. Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't think, into my ears, that recording has improved since the late 70s. Like, as soon as it went to digital, it went way off track. And there's some replacements records that are, and that just sound crazy, drum samples, and everybody was sampling the same snare drum from some, I think literally from some Bryan Adams record or something. Yeah. And then, there's some great records from the 80s that were ruined by production, like No Guru, No Method, from Van, and that's the first one that always jumps to my mind, and Tunnel of Love from Bruce, which I think is an amazing record, but it just sounds so cheesy sometimes. Mm-hmm. And then in the 90s, I think people started to get back to, perfecting digital and using it for good rather than evil. And it got a little bit better. But what we loved, all of us, was like that classic big fat tape sound, tube amps, very, what we loved about the Robbs is, like, aside from their 70s shags, which they still maintained, They had all this gear, and they told us all about it. I would never really could tell you the difference between a Neve and a Trident board, but back then, but I could, because they really schooled us. And we took the Trident board from Trident Studios in the UK, and we had our engineer come in and make us a custom one that streamlined the signal chain. So what you hear is basically as streamlined a signal chain as you could possibly get. So from the voice into the tape, and if you want to add stuff to it, you do it. You put it to tape. So, but most importantly with the Robbs is they really drove us hard, almost to a fault sometimes. Like, sing it again, sing it again, sing it again, sing it again. And it really taught me how to be a better singer, how to sing on pitch, how to recognize singing on pitch. But it was tense. I remember Chris had sang way less than I had at that point, and poor Chris was in that vocal booth doing take after take after take. And, that's when one of us would have to take the other guy and go, hey, let's go get a drink while he does the vocal tracks here, Yeah. So they would say, oh, that's a great idea. Let's do it again. Here's the guitar part. Let's do that again. And they like stereo stuff. They like 2 guitar parts. They're like, let's do 3 acoustic parts and pick the best. And, but it was great because that brought out, it made everything pretty polished, maybe to it. And that's why I said on the next record, we reacted against that and went in and we want to do this live, live vocals. So,
did you have, at any point during making this record, did you have any reservations about, having to go play this live as a 3-piece?
No. I think we were even talking about getting guys like Gil Norton, who had done the Pixies, but who had gone back to like Echo and the Bunnymen. And we liked big production records as well. I wasn't concerned about just recording at that point. I mean, I did with later records. Let's just get it back to meat and potatoes here. Mm-hmm. I was all for trying to flesh out a record and make it sound good and not worry about it. And, it's just a different version when we record it. Because I grew up with bands like the Stones that did that, and Zeppelin. They didn't try to completely replicate the sounds that they had gotten in the studio. They just approached it differently. And I don't really want to see a band completely do the same exact sounds. Even when they do their classic records, I want to hear them do something slightly different with it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that about, comparing the live versus the studio. Right now, I'm currently reading a book called Rocks Off, 50 Tracks That Tell the Story of the Rolling Stones, which just so happened to be written by you. And it's funny because I actually stumbled upon the book completely independently of this interview, I was in my local library, which is actually like less than half a block from my house, so I can walk there. And I'm going through. I just will browse the music section every once in a while to see if there's anything I haven't. And I'm like, that name looks familiar. What is this book? And I picked it up and I was like, oh crap, really? So can you talk a little bit about, you've mentioned the Stones quite a bit. I know they're an influence on you. Where did the, I guess, genesis for that book come from? Was it something that you had an idea for and then found a publisher, or did you actually write the book and then take it to the publisher? How did that work?
No, I had done a book that I did have the idea for called about Exile on Main Street, just the Exile on Main Street record, and that was about 2003 or 4 when the 33 1/3 series had just kind of gone into its. They had put out you know what I'm talking about, the 33 1/3 series.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about classic or cult records, and my friend Joe Pernice had done one on Mita's murder. And so I asked him and/or his manager Joyce, are they looking for more submissions? And she said, here's the editor's contact. So I said, listen, is anybody doing Exile on Main Street? Do you want one on Exile on Main Street? I could write for days on this record, which I needed to do, obviously. And they were into it. And so I did it on that one, but I hadn't anticipated writing another Stones book. But then their 50th anniversary was coming up, and an agent approached me to see if I wanted to do something to tie it in to the 50th anniversary. And he had that idea of doing it by tracing 50 songs through their career. I don't know if he had more of a top 50 idea or not, but it was more like, how about choose 50 songs to talk about? That was a great idea, because I don't want to write. I don't want to be a music biographer or ghostwriter so much, but I always thought I was going to write again, but I thought maybe it would be something more relevant to my own experience or era. And but I love that idea, and he had already gotten some interest from the concept with maybe a different writer who didn't end up doing it. And then I took the idea and kind of made it into more of like my own, and tracing, the 50 years from their first recorded original single all the way through their latest at that point album. So it's not a top 50, but it's like 50 great songs, I think, that really span that whole era. And I kind of hang the chronology and history of the band and the context of what was going on with the band when they wrote that song, how it related to it, and how it represented the era. And part of my inspiration was this book called A Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald, called A Revolution in the Head, the Beatles in the 60s. And he really ties together the events of the 60s with the Beatles recordings and how one influenced the other. So you contextualize the songs in that way. And so I try to do the same thing. I think I pulled it off pretty well with the Stones book.
I agree. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it because I'm a slow reader. So I only can read about 2 or 3 songs an evening. And it's really been educational. I mean, I thought I knew quite a bit about the Stones. I mean, I've gone back and listened to all those, they're one of those bands, which we don't really have. I guess we've kind of gotten back into singles more, but it seemed like in the 80s and 90s, one-off singles sort of went away, especially in the 90s. You would just put out an album and you maybe do an EP, but having like an actual one-off single that would have no relation to an album was kind of lost for a while.
Right.
But I think the Stones were, really one of those bands that put out some of their best material, not even on records, which is mind-blowing to me. That, the album format hadn't really taken shape the way that it did over the decades. But it's really been really interesting going back, and a lot of the songs that I knew, it's cool to get the insights that you provide, and then also some of the songs that I was not as familiar with, because then I can just hop into my music catalog or my music library and go, oh, now I can go listen to that. I anytime there's a biography book or something about songwriting. I don't know if you've read the Jeff Emmerich book. I think it's called Here Today and Tomorrow, or it's the one about the Beatles. It's all the recorded history of the Beatles recording.
Yeah,
and it's
I haven't read
fascinating.
that. Yeah, I've got the Beatles Sessions book, and he plays a big part in that. But I haven't read his book yet,
Yeah.
which I really would like to. But yeah, and the Beatles famously wouldn't. The Stones would put singles on albums later in different territories. We're talking about the '60s. When the '70s came around, everybody sort of did the same thing and unified their releases in the UK and the US for the most part. But
Right.
the Beatles, I just got the mono set last year, which is great because you realize how many of the Beatles' great songs are not on any record. I mean, I realized that, I knew it already, but they wouldn't even succumb to putting on singles onto one of the albums in the other territory. It was single and then the album. That was a whole new batch of material. Yeah.
I think the probably the band that did that last and did it well was probably the Smiths. The Smiths put out a lot of singles that weren't on records.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it did sort of linger in the UK too for other bands. You're right. Yeah, but with the Stones book, I think my strength, and it's something I'd like to do. And I shouldn't say my strength so much as like how I distinguish myself. I think from other music writers is that I think I'm pretty good at articulating why I love these songs. And I had been doing this freelance a bit even before the Exile book on allmusic.com when they started doing song reviews as opposed to just album reviews. And I did a bunch of those just freelancing when my first child was born and I was home with the computer. And I loved getting into that and like what was going on in the studio, but also like why this chord change? What is it that does? What is it about the song that brings us to our knees? Like why is this song so great as opposed to these other songs? And what's he saying there? Oh my God, I can't believe he's saying that. That kind of stuff that's what I want to. I like reading biographies certainly, but I would much more when it comes to music. Personally, as a reader, gravitate towards books written by musicians. Like that's why Keith's book was particularly valuable to Stones fans, but even more so to me writing this. I don't know if I would have been able to write my rock soft book as well. I'm certain I wouldn't have been able to write it as well without Keith's insight that he provided in his book.
So did you get to do interviews with certain people? I'm assuming that Keith was probably off in his castle somewhere and not as reachable.
Yeah, I can't say I killed myself to try to get the Stones themselves because I just felt like it was futile. There's no way that they themselves were going to. But I got I got a lot of the sidemen, including Chuck Leavell, who's with them in sort of their music director now, who's in the Allman Brothers. So I got him. I got Andy Johns, the great engineer producer of Zeppelin and the Stones, Glenn Johns' brother, who just passed away this past year. So I got to talk to him for hours in a couple of days. Got to talk to Bobby Keys, the sax player on Brown Sugar and everything else. And I got to talk to Mary Clayton on Give Me Shelter and talking about, when you talk about 20 Feet from Stardom, that's how I got to know the director of that movie. I was trying to track down Mary Clayton, and I saw that this movie was in production, 20 Feet from Stardom, and I reached out to Morgan, and it turns out he was a fan of Buffalo Tom, so he hooked me up with Mary. So that was an extremely gratifying conversation. And I talked to Chris Kimsey, who did, Some Girls and Emotional Rescue and those 80s records as well. So that was fun. So I got to talk to a lot of people that were directly involved in making the record. Al Cooper, who plays organ and piano on You Can't Always Get What You Want. He lives around Boston. Yeah, so that was a fun part. I'm a nervous interviewer. I'm not a journalist, so once I got over that nervousness, it was just a musician talking to other musicians.
Gotcha. Well, I can understand that. I just have a beer. That's what keeps me from not being nervous.
Yeah.
One last question before we let you go, because we kind of kept you on a little bit longer than we intended. You mentioned earlier about trying to go back through the chronology of Buffalo Tom and put some things in place. Would that happen to be for maybe like reissues, expanded versions on vinyl, that sort of thing? Is there any possibility of like Big Red Letter Day coming out in double gatefold 180 gram vinyl in the next year or two?
Well, I think we would do Let Me Come Over before, and I think we are planning at least on feeling that out. I think Let Me Come Over would be 25th anniversary soon. Is that right? I'm not good with the numbers.
It'll be 2017, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a little bit far out. So I don't know, but I think we're going to reissue that at some point. We're talking to our old label Beggars, and I don't know. We have to figure out as a band. I think we're going to do that. We have to, but we have all kinds. I have all kinds of old demos and archival stuff. So yeah, there's a bit of that, but it wouldn't be. I don't think we'd do Big Red Letter Day first. Let Me Come Over is more sort of the landmark record. I think for most people. I think you're right. I think it's sort of half and half. Honestly, more people got turned on to us by Big Red Letter Day. I think that record means more to them for that reason. And I think it's more people's favorite in a lot of ways. But there's Taillights Fade from Let Me Come Over, which the song alone is sort of a signature song for us.
Yes, absolutely. Well, 86 was the start, so 2016 would be the 30th anniversary just overall of the band. So there could be a tie-in, maybe put out all three records, put that out with those two with Sleepy Eyed. You mentioned that being the sort of the trilogy of the records. That would be a nice little present for 2016.
Yeah, I don't know. I know. We had our 25th anniversary, which we marked with 3 shows here in Boston. But that was really kind of all we did for that. So I don't know. Yeah, we were together in September and we talked threw a few ideas around, but I don't know what's going to come together. We'll see.
Well, Bill, I cannot thank you enough for spending your Sunday evening with us and talking about all this stuff, getting deep into the various histories and guitar setups and all those sorts of things that we nerd out about. So greatly appreciate your time. And when those do come out, we'll be looking forward to it. Because I know that right now, I think Big Red Letter Day is only available on vinyl in Europe from the original pressing.
Oh, yeah.
So I just have the CD. Just had the same CD since 93, I guess. So I'd like to try it out on my new record player since that's coming back.
All right. Well, thanks to you guys. Thanks for your interest in your time. I'm glad to talk about it.
And then, of course, you have a bunch of solo records out, and people can go to your website, billjanovitz.com, to listen to stuff and buy stuff. And they can also go to buffalotom.com for when there's the posting of a random show. I know you guys don't play much or as much as you used to, but there's still the occasional show that you guys play, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, certainly between in the Northeast corridor here. We were touring as recently as across the states. I think 11 was the last time we were out to the West Coast in Chicago and that sort of thing. But yeah, we may start to heat up a little bit more as the kids get older, and it's just flexibility with life.
Well, Bill, thank you, and for all our listeners out there, I want to remind everybody to hit up our iTunes page, leave us some feedback on this episode. Thank all of our listeners at our various outlets, Radio I.O., Stitcher, iTunes, Podbean, all that sort of stuff. And that's it. That is our 201st episode in the books. 202 coming up next. I don't have that one scheduled yet, so we'll have to find out what's going to happen. But we'll be back next week with another episode. Dig me out.
I suppose I'm just too late for the life.
Join the conversation about this episode at digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook page and Twitter feed, as well as links to our request a review and merchandise pages.